This is Rocky Mountain Voices, powered by PodTech.
It's time for What's New, the show that features the latest developments in the software industry that are driving innovation today. What's New is on the air right now.
Hi, I'm Jason Bellarm. I'm sitting here with Mauro Cardarelli.
Hi, Jason.
How are you doing?
Very well.
Good. Mauro's with Jornada, and you've done a lot of work with ISVs in the SharePoint space.
Correct.
And so, I wanted you to talk to the audience a little bit about what you've done with SharePoint. There's a ton of buzz around SharePoint right now, and every partner I go into wants to do something with SharePoint. Just like to learn a little bit from your experiences. What kinds of things have you seen SharePoint really successful with, and what are ISVs doing with it?
Okay. So from an organizational perspective, I think we start with the traditional intranet environment where an organization, pretty much of any size across many of the verticals, is looking for an easy way to stand a web-based environment where employees can collaborate, they can get access to corporate news, corporate employee directory, just the single place where an organization can funnel folks so that they have a launching pad into information or other applications. And I think that with SharePoint 2007, Microsoft has extended that model where organizations now are thinking beyond the intranet, and they're looking at things like extranets where they're interacting with their customers, their partners, and looking for ways of sharing information, posting information, all under the security blanket. And even into the internet, I think you'll see more and more today, and it's funny how you go out on websites, again, across many different product and service offerings, and you'll see SharePoint, MOS, as the core delivery mechanism for organizations. And I think that one of the powerful things is that it is so many things to so many people that an organization can take that tool and sort of have a consistency across the platform where it becomes their intranet, extranet, and internet solution. So I think that we've seen a lot of adoption in the market, again, from organizations as small as 30 people to as big as 150,000 employees globally, all using the same platform with the same business objectives.
Well, that's great. And so how can an independent software vendor plug into that momentum of that platform? What are the best ways to leverage SharePoint?
Right, and so from an ISV perspective, the great thing about SharePoint is that for the most part, you know it exists, right? And while many organizations can do different things with it, because there's a core component, a core engine, people are using document libraries, they're storing files and so forth. As an ISV, you can think of it as one of two things. You can plug your tools into SharePoint and deliver functionality that it is not or it doesn't do well by building web parts that snap into SharePoint. And the other is to take advantage of the data that SharePoint offers or stores to either to flow it into your applications or flow out of it into your application. So again, from an ISV perspective, if you have a business intelligence offering where you have graphical presentation of data, you build web parts and you can throw it in. If you're doing analytics and your business is really around the formulas that you manage, again, you can build web parts or you can take data that's in SharePoint and flow it into your application. So SharePoint becomes the data collection mechanism, and then your application can still stand alone and drive a lot of the business processes that you do well. Again, you can have a vertical niche through the market, so you can target financial services companies where you know that they're going to be transactional, and SharePoint is not a transaction system. You can go into medical or legal or some of those niche plays in the verticals, take your industry expertise, take that technology platform and put them together and have an offering around the two.
So you talked about two different models. I heard web parts in there, and then I heard more of a services-based approach.
Mm-hmm.
Can you give examples of what a good web part might be and how you might interact at a service level with SharePoint?
Sure. And again, one of the things that organizations are trying to do when they build an intranet or a collaboration platform on SharePoint is really expose the whole company to the wide variety of information that they have. And SharePoint can't manage it all, right? So it's a document management system. I can put HR forms in there. I can put some of the expense reports and some of the other things that I might want to manage that are file-based. But then we have applications. CRM is an example. SharePoint's not a CRM system. We're using another third party for that. We don't necessarily want folks to think SharePoint is all of these things and now I need to jump over and go somewhere else for CRM. So if you have a CRM product that has web parts that snap in, you have the consistency of the interface, and folks can navigate through that environment and jump into those applications while not necessarily knowing that they're going somewhere else. So that's an example. And that also flows into graphical presentation of data, accessing data, and then the other side of the model is to really take advantage of the information that's being stored. So you have an application, maybe records management, right? There's two levels to it. That SharePoint has a base model, but maybe you need really advanced archiving where you want it to go off-site and be in some other facility based on some expiration date, and you're really looking for the data. You have the data storage. You need to go from here to there based on some business rules. Again, you build an application using event handlers or some triggering mechanism within SharePoint that will physically move things out of SharePoint and into another repository. Again, taking advantage of the interface that everyone knows and loves, and then building or extending it to snap it nicely with your application.
And you talked about the interface that everybody knows and loves. Have you seen many SharePoint implementations where we're not using the SharePoint interface, for instance, where we've deeply customized it? So I've seen, like, for instance, the Microsoft.com website is actually, it's SharePoint, right?
Right.
Have you seen any other implementations like that?
I think primarily in the internet space, you'll go to, and it's amazing, I've seen casino websites, I've seen insurance websites, hair products, and I think Microsoft has a list, and you'd never know. And from an end user perspective, you don't necessarily care. And it's a content management, content publishing mechanism. And that's one way. I've seen organizations on both the intranet and extranet side invest heavily in branding, because especially on extranet as an example, where you're showcasing your capabilities to your partner or customer community, you want it to look nice. You may not want to go with the standard blue and orange of SharePoint. And again, that's where you take the native capability of the master pages and the styling and so forth, and you have something that no one knows is SharePoint, but you've got this inherent ability to store and present information all in a secure means. Again, trying to take the model of an organization's investment in Microsoft technologies, Active Directory, SQL Server, and so forth, and just taking it that one step further and starting to bring your applications together, sort of having this uniform. And I think when I talked earlier around the excitement around SharePoint, it's this notion of this uniform interface, this coming together of all of this disparate information in the organization and giving a single point of access. And again, from an ISV perspective, you can really help in extending that or enabling that vision. SharePoint can't be everything, right? I talked earlier about it's not a CRM system, and you don't necessarily want to customize SharePoint so much so that it becomes your CRM system. But what you can do as an ISV that specializes in the space is to deliver web parts or extend SharePoint so that there's a strong integration. So from an end user perspective, there's a name somewhere, and it ties into another application, and it brings me back information. And there you have an invoicing system behind the scenes, and I bring up a customer, and I want to see all the information there. Whether you're using Business Data Catalog within SharePoint to do that, or a third-party application that integrates with a custom data source. Again, from an end user perspective, the power really is I'm going to the one place. It's the URL that I know, and I'm getting all the information that I need.
Well, that's great. And you talked about all these great integration points. What are the technologies that are used to enable this? Are we still doing ASP, VB6? What is it code-based? What do we do SharePoint development with?
So when we're talking about inside of SharePoint and we're building web parts, we're using .NET. Right? We're using VB.NET or C#, and Microsoft provides a framework for that. And in that case, we're doing a couple of things. We're either using the SharePoint object model, where we're traversing a collection of sites or documents or list items and coming back with information, and then either firing off our custom functionality or pushing data inside and outside of SharePoint. So we're using .NET, and we're using the SharePoint object model, the SharePoint APIs, the SharePoint web services to acquire the data and do stuff with it. And then the other is to, the standard, I've got ASPX pages, and I've got a frame around them so it looks like it and feels like it's in SharePoint, but it's actually owned and living outside of SharePoint. That's sort of the softer approach. I think from a customer perspective, what people want is that true sense of integration. Again, it's much more perception than peeking under the covers and seeing where all the wiring is going. So that's where the power of a web part comes in. And again, one of the powers of SharePoint is that it's so business facing, right? You've got a community of users. Your typical SharePoint champion is not a .NET developer, is not the person who's writing that code, but very much has the need for the process. So to give them a deployment process where you say, go to modify the page, look at the gallery of web parts, and now here's my custom web parts, and I drag and drop, I set some configuration, boom, I see a chart, or I see my data, or I can push a button and all of my documents go somewhere else. That's the true power of that. That integration is much more of a perception-based model than it is, under the covers we've extended the SharePoint database schema to include our tables and so forth, because from a support standpoint, obviously that's a bad thing.
No, that's great. You've brought up a couple of really good integration points, and it seems like there's a good roadmap there for ISVs to plug in. Where do you recommend they go to get started? What should they do?
I think, again, we're talking about MOS 2007.
And to clarify, that's Microsoft Office SharePoint Server.
2007, exactly. And so it's relatively new to the market, although we're coming up
About
on
a year.
Yeah, 9+ months.
Yeah.
I think the web, looking at the community of developers who've published code out there, you're looking at MSDN still. Microsoft is a primary source. The documentation around the web part object, the web part deployment object model for SharePoint and so forth. You've got a collection of books on the market that sort of talk through those same mechanisms, and it's just really build the first one and then learn the deployment process, and then for those people who are really strong in the .NET space, they can really start to take advantage of the power and start to build. I've seen some very sophisticated, some very high-end web parts out there, and then they're highly reusable. So from an ISV perspective, there's a market there for resale.
And I've seen you do some pretty spectacular stuff with SharePoint too, and you've got a book out on it, right?
Exactly. So Scott Jameson from Microsoft and I and Sue Hanley wrote a book on SharePoint. Again, much more business facing, but I think what we're trying to do is to show folks that there's a community of users out there inside your organization that are hungry for this collaborative communication environment and really trying to bring all of this information together. And I think that SharePoint offers that. And again, for those folks who've invested in Microsoft already with SQL Server, with Active Directory, with Office, this is a natural extension. So what we've seen is the training times be very low. I mean, there's a consistency in SharePoint from content contribution to page creation. The role of webmaster is diminished, right? So it's not someone emailing a page or a document saying, can you please post this? They're going to the URL, they're putting a file out there, and suddenly HR owns all of their content, and there's a power to that.
A whole new level of enablement.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Very much. SharePoint is very much an enabling tool. I think that when I talk to folks, especially on the developer side, is it a framework? Is it a product? And to me, I just sort of throw those. It's an enabler, which means you can do with it what you want.
That's great. Well, thank you very much, Mauro. And
pleasure.
good luck to Jornada.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Excellent.